Imagine wanting something so badly that it just completely dismantles your life. I mean, you sacrifice your career, your relationships, your health, all to just chase this one specific thing.
Yeah.
But here is the ultimate paradox for you. When you finally get it, you don't even enjoy it. Like,
Yeah.
the pleasure is entirely gone, but the drive to get it is somehow stronger than ever.
It is so counterintuitive.
Right. So today, we're doing a deep dive into the biological paradox of addiction. Our mission today is to decode the incredibly complex world of substance use disorders.
Which is really one of the most misunderstood mechanisms in the human body. We're going to explore how substances actually hijack the brain, how dependence physically forms, and this is wild. The massive, surprisingly bitter debates still raging in the scientific community about what this condition even is.
Because usually, when you get a medical diagnosis, you expect precision. If you break your arm, the doctor points to a jagged white line on an X-ray and says, well, there it is.
Right, exactly.
But when you step into the diagnostic landscape of substance use disorders, that X-ray machine is fundamentally broken. The very definition of addiction just keeps changing depending on what decade you're in.
Which is deeply unsettling for a lot of people, I think. Because if you look back before 1980, the psychiatric community didn't even have a single official category for addiction.
Wait, really? Nothing at all?
Not as a primary illness, no.
Yeah.
Alcoholism and drug problems were largely lumped into these incredibly vague, kind of dismissive personality disorder labels. It was treated as a symptom of a defective character, not a physiological issue.
Wow. So just a moral failure, basically.
Pretty much. But then 1980 rolls around with the DSM-3, that's the big psychiatric diagnostic manual, and they attempt to map the territory by splitting it into two distinct diagnoses.
Right.
You had substance abuse, which was defined by harmful behavioral patterns, like getting into legal trouble or driving under the influence. And then you had substance dependence, which was considered the severe version. And that was anchored in physical adaptations like tolerance and withdrawal.
And on paper, that split makes logical sense, right? Like, the theory was that people would start in the abuse category and organically progress into the dependence category.
That was the idea, yeah. But that held for about 30 years until researchers realized the data did not match the theory at all. These didn't behave like two clean stages of a single illness.
Right, because you could have someone who met the criteria for abuse, like maybe they got a DUI in college, but they never once progressed to dependence.
Exactly.
And when clinicians actually looked at real patients, the symptom checklists overlapped in this messy, totally contradictory way. Plus, the terminology itself was creating massive structural problems in healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. The word abuse carries intense stigma. It heavily implies willful misconduct, criminality.
A conscious choice to do bad.
Right. And meanwhile, the medical community was constantly conflating the word dependence with the normal, routine, physical adaptations a patient might develop to a prescribed medication.
Right, like if you take a normal drug.
Yeah, like if you take a beta blocker for your heart or a legally prescribed painkiller for a month, your body develops a pharmacological dependence. You will have withdrawal symptoms if you stop abruptly, but you do not have an addiction.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because having a diagnostic manual that confuses routine physical tolerance with a compulsive psychological disorder is just a recipe for disaster.
It was a huge problem.
So in 2013, the DSM-5 finally scrapped the two separate categories and fused them into a single diagnosis, which is substance use disorder, placed on the severity continuum of mild, moderate, or severe.
Yeah, they just put it all on one spectrum.
But why does this shifting label matter to you, the listener? Well, it matters because the label society puts on a condition, dictates how the healthcare system, the law, and your community treat the person who has it.
And the crazy part is we still don't have global consensus on this.
No. Really?
Yeah, you have a DSM-5 in the U.S. using this single severity continuum. But the World Health Organization's ICD-11 still maintains a separate concept of a harmful pattern of use alongside a distinct dependence syndrome.
That is wild. The top diagnostic systems in the world are still negotiating how to carve up the exact same reality.
They really are. And to understand why this is so incredibly difficult to pin down today, we kind of have to look at the origin story of the science.
Yeah, let's go back. Because historically, humanity almost universally judged heavy drinking or drug use as a moral failing. Like you said, a sin.
Right.
But in 1784, Benjamin Rush, an American physician, published a radical alternative. He described chronic drunkenness as a disease of the will.
It was a profound philosophical shift. Rush argued that once the behavior becomes habitual, the drinker literally loses the voluntary power to stop. And this planted the seed for the disease model. But it took nearly 2 centuries for the science to actually catch up. It wasn't until 1960 that E.M. Jelinek published the disease concept of alcoholism, proposing that it progressed through identifiable, biologically driven phases.
Which was a massive political victory, honestly. It
Yeah.
gave organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous a medical framework. It pulled the issue out of the criminal justice realm and pushed it toward public health.
Exactly.
But the real turning point where this transition from behavioral observation into hard neuroscience happened in 1954 with James Olds and Peter Milner.
Oh, this is one of the most famous experiments in psychology.
It's intense.
It is. Olds and Milner implanted electrodes into the brains of rats, specifically targeting a bundle of tissue that connects the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, to the nucleus accumbens.
Okay, VTA to the nucleus accumbens.
Right, and they gave the rats a lever that would deliver a tiny electrical shock to stimulate that specific pathway.
And the results were horrifying, frankly.
Yeah.
These rats would press the lever thousands of times an hour. They ignored their food, they ignored water, they ignored mating. They would literally starve themselves to death just to keep electrically stimulating that exact pathway.
Because that pathway, the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, is the brain's core reward circuit. As neuroimaging advanced, scientists realized that this is the exact same circuit hijacked by every single major addictive drug, from alcohol to opioids to cocaine.
Wait, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. So the VTA is essentially the brain's engine for desire, and the nucleus accumbens is the steering wheel.
That's a great way to think about it.
How do they actually communicate to drive that kind of extreme behavior, though?
So the VTA produces a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which acts as the signal or the fuel in your analogy. It sends that dopamine to the nucleus accumbens, which processes motivation and goal-directed behavior.
Okay, I'm following.
When you eat a good meal, your VTA releases a normal splash of dopamine, and your nucleus accumbens says, oh, that was good, remember how to do that again. Addictive drugs act like a biological sledgehammer. They artificially flood that pathway with a tsunami of dopamine that completely dwarfs any natural reward.
And by the late 90s, this discovery fundamentally changed the paradigm. It's like neuroscientists suddenly discovered the brain's master override switch.
Exactly.
In 1997, Alan Leshner, who was the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, published a landmark essay in Science declaring, addiction is a brain disease, and it matters. We stopped asking, why is this person morally weak? And started asking, what is this specific molecule doing to this specific circuit?
But the brain is incredibly adaptive, right? It operates on the principle of homeostasis. It constantly wants to maintain a stable baseline.
It wants balance.
Right. So when a substance repeatedly floods the system with massive artificial spikes of dopamine, the brain fights back. It assumes there's too much stimulation, so it downregulates.
Downregulates.
Yeah, it actively begins producing less dopamine naturally, and it prunes away its own dopamine receptors to mute the incoming signal.
Hold on, so you're saying my brain actively fights against the drug?
Yes.
It's not just that the drug stops working as well over time, it's that my brain is physically altering its own architecture to protect itself from the flood.
Precisely. Your brain is aggressively defending its baseline. But the consequence of that neuroplasticity is devastating.
Because now you have fewer receptors.
Right. Without the drug, your dopamine levels plummet way below normal. Ordinary pleasures like a beautiful sunset, a hug from your kid, a great meal, they barely register. They feel completely flat because you lack the receptors to process natural joy. This is the biological root of tolerance and physical dependence. You literally need the substance just to reach a functional baseline.
But there is a second mechanism at play here, and this explains that paradox we started the deep dive with.
Yes, it does.
In 1993, psychologists Terry Robinson and Kent Berridge proposed the incentive sensitization theory. They realized that pleasure is not a single unified experience in the brain. They separated it into 2 distinct neurological dials.
I love this theory.
It's brilliant.
Right.
So you have liking, which is the actual moment-to-moment enjoyment of a reward, and wanting, which is the compulsive motivational pull toward it.
And they are driven by different neurochemical systems entirely. Liking is more closely tied to opioid and endocannabinoid receptors, while wanting is driven by that dopamine pathway we just discussed.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Robinson and Berridge showed that as a person repeatedly uses an addictive substance, these 2 dials move in opposite directions.
Right.
Because of that downregulation we just talked about,
Yeah.
the liking system builds massive tolerance.
Yeah.
The actual pleasure of the high fades away.
But the wanting system, that dopamine-driven motivation circuit, actually becomes sensitized. It
Yes.
becomes hyperreactive to any cues associated with the drug.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly this maps onto the clinical reality that therapists see every day.
Right.
As addiction progresses to the severe end of the spectrum, patients will sit in a clinic in tears, saying, I hate this drug, I don't even enjoy it anymore, it is ruining my life.
And yet, if they see a needle or a specific street corner or even feel a specific kind of stress, their sensitized wanting system triggers an overwhelming, practically irresistible compulsion to use.
To put it in perspective, it is like a broken car stereo.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
The volume knob for the music. The pleasure is stuck on low, you can barely hear it. But the volume for the alarm bell, the craving, the wanting, is turned up to a deafening roar. And you just can't turn the alarm off.
Exactly. It's a mechanical failure of the brain's motivational hierarchy. But, this brings us to a massive structural debate in the field.
A pushback.
Yeah, because if addiction is entirely explained by a hijacked dopamine circuit and missing receptors, then the chemical hook of the drug is all that matters, right?
Well, you would think so. I mean, if the molecule breaks the machine, it's just chemistry. But the environmental data fundamentally contradicts that.
It really does.
Let's look at Bruce Alexander's rat park studies from the late 1970s.
Up until Alexander's work, the proof that drugs like opioids were inherently irresistibly addictive came from experiments similar to Olds and Milner.
Right, the isolated rats.
Yeah, researchers would lock a rat alone in a tiny bare metal cage and give it a choice between normal water and morphine-laced water. Unsurprisingly, the isolated rats drank the morphine until they overdosed.
But Alexander looked at that and said, well, you haven't proven that the drug is irresistible. You've proven that being locked in solitary confinement is unbearable.
Exactly.
So he built Rat Park, a massive enriched enclosure with running wheels, toys, platforms, and dozens of other rats to socialize and mate with. Then he offered the Rat Park residents the exact same choice of water bottles.
And the contrast was staggering. The rats in the enriched environment consumed dramatically less morphine.
Like almost none.
Right. Even when researchers tried to force the issue by sweetening the morphine water to hide its bitter taste, the socially connected rats largely ignored it. They occasionally sampled it, but they didn't compulsively self-destruct.
And this translates directly to humans. Right around the same time, in 1974, psychiatrist Lee Robbins published a highly anticipated study on U.S. soldiers returning from the Vietnam War.
This study blew people's minds.
Yeah, because while deployed in Vietnam, roughly 15 to 20% of American troops used heroin regularly enough to be clinically classified as addicted. The government was terrified of a massive, uncontrollable wave of addiction sweeping the country when the troops came home.
But the wave never hit.
No.
Robbins's data showed that the overwhelming majority of those soldiers simply stopped using heroin once they returned to the States, and they did so without formal rehab. The remission rates were astronomically higher than anything seen in domestic civilian heroin populations.
But wait, if environment and social connection are this powerful, aren't the neuroscientists completely overhyping the chemical hooks?
Well, that's the big question.
I mean, if you can literally pluck someone out of a war zone, put them in a suburban living room, and the compulsion evaporates, how can we confidently call this a chronic, permanent brain disease?
That tension is the exact fault line of the most heated debate in addiction research today.
The great push and pull, brain disease versus learning.
Exactly. On one side, you have the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the NIDA camp, heavily influenced by Nora Volkow.
Right.
They maintain that addiction is fundamentally a chronic, relapsing brain disease. They point to the fMRI scans showing those blunted dopamine receptors and physically compromised prefrontal cortices as proof of a pathological state.
But on the other side, you have heavy-hitting critics like psychologist Gene Hamann and neuroscientist Mark Lewis.
Yeah.
They argue that calling it a disease fundamentally mischaracterizes what the brain is doing. Lewis argues the brain is highly neuroplastic. It is simply doing exactly what it evolved to do, wiring in a heavily rewarded behavior.
And Heyman backs this up by pointing out that large epidemiological surveys show the vast majority of people who meet the criteria for substance dependence naturally age out of it by their 30s.
Right, without rehab.
Without rehab.
Yeah.
They take on careers, get married, and recalibrate their behaviors without formal medical intervention.
So Heyman argues that natural remission is incredibly difficult to square with a rigid disease model that implies permanent brain damage.
Right. But to understand why the compulsion is so strong in the moment, we have to look beyond just dopamine and rewards. We have to look at the dark side of addiction, which is George Koob's allostasis model.
Let's get into this because this explains the neurobiology of the environment.
Right. Koob proposed that as the reward system downregulates, a completely different shadow system in the brain fires up.
A shadow system.
Yeah, the brain's stress networks involving hormones like corticotropin releasing factor become chronically overactive. This creates a baseline state of severe anxiety, dysphoria, and physical unease.
So it's like a thermostat that gets broken during a heat wave. The AC blasts freezing air constantly, and eventually, the only reason the person uses the drug is just to temporarily turn off the freezing air.
Exactly.
They aren't drinking or using to feel high, which is positive reinforcement. They are using just to stop feeling agonizingly awful, which is negative reinforcement.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Koob's model fundamentally shifts our empathy. Late-stage addiction is not a hedonistic pursuit. It is a desperate biological attempt to escape a self-inflicted state of chronic stress.
Wow.
And this explains the Vietnam veterans. In Vietnam, their stress thermostats were maxed out by the environment, driving the negative reinforcement. Once they returned to a safe environment, the stress system cooled down, and the drive to self-medicate faded.
And this debate between disease, choice, and environmental learning is not just academic philosophy, right? It dictates real-world treatment, and it can get incredibly ugly.
Oh, it really can.
Look at the controlled drinking fight of the 1970s. Mark and Linda Sobel conducted research where they used behavior therapy to train a small group of alcohol-dependent individuals to moderate their drinking, rather than abstain entirely.
And the backlash was unprecedented.
Unprecedented.
The absolute orthodoxy of the time, driven by the AA disease model, dictated that one drop of alcohol would inevitably trigger full relapse. The Sobel's research challenged that core tenet, suggesting it was a learned behavior that could be unlearned.
And people did not like that.
No, they were accused of scientific fraud, investigated by congressional committees, and effectively blacklisted by parts of the community.
They were eventually completely exonerated, but it proved how fiercely ideological this field is. We are still split today between strict abstinence-only models and harm reduction approaches. And the way we define the neurobiology literally shapes public policy and corporate behavior.
Which brings us to the Purdue pharma catastrophe.
Yeah.
In the mid-1990s, Purdue launched OxyContin and aggressively marketed it to physicians for chronic pain. They claimed that because of its time-release formula, the risk of addiction was less than 1%.
Purdue exploited a massive gap in medical education. They deliberately conflated physical dependence with addiction to reassure doctors. Let's break down why those two things are biologically different, because this is one of the most dangerous misconceptions out there.
Yeah, let's look at it. If you take a cancer patient and put them on long-term opioids for severe pain, their brain will adapt. They will develop tolerance, and if you take the medication away, they will suffer severe physical withdrawal.
Right.
That is physical dependence. But that cancer patient does not typically exhibit the destructive, craving-driven, harm despite consequences behavior of the sensitized wanting system.
They aren't robbing pharmacies to get more pills.
Exactly. Conflating normal physical adaptation with a compulsive disorder is exactly how Purdue justified flooding the market with highly addictive narcotics.
Which directly triggered the opioid crisis we're still fighting today. And this ties into another massive myth, the idea that addiction is just a lack of willpower. If someone really wants to quit, they should just be able to stop, right?
You would think so, but the brain scans show otherwise. We mentioned the prefrontal cortex earlier.
The steering wheel part.
Well, the prefrontal cortex is more like the brakes. It's the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, assessing future consequences, and overriding immediate desires.
Ah, okay.
Prolonged substance use physically alters and impairs that exact region. The very biological equipment a person needs to exercise willpower and just stop is physically compromised by the disorder itself.
It's like asking someone to run a marathon on a broken leg and calling them lazy when they collapse.
Exactly.
Which leads to the final myth that you have to wait for someone to hit rock bottom before they can recover. The natural remission data from Gene Heyman completely dismantles this. People naturally exit these behaviors gradually as their environmental and social circumstances change.
Right.
Waiting for a catastrophic rock bottom just delays early interventions that could save lives.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now? Why does pausing the difference between a brain disease and extreme learning matter?
Well, it matters because we are in the middle of a historic public health emergency driven by synthetic fentanyl, where a single relapse can be fatal. It matters because of parity laws, which now legally require health insurance companies to cover addiction treatment, just like they cover diabetes or heart disease.
Right. The scientific definition guarantees the funding.
Exactly.
And it matters because we now know from twin studies that substance use disorders have a genetic heritability rate of 40 to 60%. We understand why it runs in families.
But that genetic loading is not an inescapable fate, right?
No, it requires an environmental trigger. It is a collision of biology and context.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We tracked the shifting definitions from moral failing to the DSM-30 split to the unified continuum of the DSM-5.
Yeah.
We explored how the brain's wanting system can completely overpower the liking system, leaving people compulsively driven without any actual pleasure.
We unpack the incredible power of the environment through Rat Park and the Vietnam studies, showing that isolation and stress are the ultimate catalysts for neurobiological dependence.
Right.
And we waded into the fierce debate over whether to frame this as a chronic brain disease or a highly neuroplastic form of environmental learning.
The reality is that addiction sits right in that messy intersection of chemistry, context, and choice. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Go for it.
We established through Mark Lewis that addiction might be the brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, wiring in heavily rewarded behaviors.
Yeah.
And we've seen from Bruce Alexander's Rat Park that isolation and lack of meaning drive the compulsion to seek out those chemical rewards.
Absolutely.
So what happens when we look at our modern digital society through that exact lens? We live in a world where physical isolation is at an all-time high. Yet we are constantly surrounded by technologies, platforms, and algorithms that are quite literally engineered by behavioral psychologists to deliver hyper-palatable, dopamine-flooding rewards at the simple swipe of a screen.
Oh, wow.
Are we slowly, collectively building a sort of reverse Rat Park, a society where the cages are entirely invisible, but our brain's reward circuits are constantly under siege from artificial stimulation and extreme social isolation? It is something to seriously think about the next time you feel that uncontrollable, mindless pull to keep scrolling even when you weren't enjoying it.
It definitely challenges us to look far beyond just the chemistry of a drug and closely examine the context of the world we are building for ourselves.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the labels, keep exploring the science, and remember, the picture might not always be as clear as a broken bone on an X-ray, but the more we understand the mechanisms, the better we can navigate the murky waters. Take care.